Hi everyone, so this is the presentation for our group AI the A-hole. To summarize our story in a nutshell, it's basically trying to replicate the experience of going on the subreddit r slash am I the asshole and reading all of these stories involving all these people making moral decisions and trying to decide whether someone is at fault in a given situation. So to start off, we can click start game, and we're presented with the titles for all of these possible stories that we can read. So let's try reading story 1. So we're presented with this story, and we have to decide whether the person in the story is YTA, meaning you're the asshole, or they're at fault, or NTA, not the asshole, or not at fault. So after reading the story, let's say we decide the person is actually at fault. So we get feedback on whether we were right or wrong by seeing all of these comments that these quote unquote other users made. So it looks like they agree with us. They're also voting YTA. So we get some validation right here. Let's try going for another story. Let's go for story 2. So same thing again, we read the story and make our decision. I think they're not at fault in this situation. So that's great. It looks like we were correct again. Let's go for another story. Let's read it through. I think they're not at fault. So something that can happen occasionally is we get challenged. So we feel uncertain. We look at some comments arguing against the decision we made to help us maybe reevaluate our decision. So we chose NTA, and the game presents us a bunch of YTA comments. And after this, we can reevaluate our decision. So I think I got persuaded by these generated comments. So let's click YTA. And oh no, it looks like we made the wrong choice. The answer was NTA. So after going through a bunch of these stories, we can click end game. And this essentially gives us the game results. It shows us all of the rounds we played in. It shows us a summary of the title and the choices we made and whether we were right or wrong. So let's discuss a little bit how the story generation model works. So to create the story generation model, we had to overcome two main challenges. The first is the usual challenge you have with generating stories, which is that we wanted our story to be coherent, entertaining to read, and unique in the sense that it wasn't just copying a story off of Reddit verbatim. And second is, since our goal in the game is trying to guess the label of a story, we wanted to ensure that we actually had some control over the label of the story generated. We tried a bunch of different approaches for the story generation model. One approach that we tried was title-based generation, where we gave the model the title and label as a prompt and asked it to generate a story as a completion. Another thing we tried is keyword-based generation, where we pass in keyword and plot elements from the story to the model along with the label and ask it to generate a story. And what we found worked best was this comment-based generation system. The way this works is we fed the model as a prompt comments from a given post and use the post itself as the completion. By doing this, we can essentially create new stories by randomly sampling a bunch of NTA comments to generate an NTA story, or randomly sampling a bunch of YTA comments to generate a YTA story. While we found that the stories generated by this model were mostly coherent and interesting, one thing that we still struggled with was label control. On average, only 63% of the time did the story generated actually match the label that we wanted the story to have. And we can break this down even further. When we asked the model to generate an NTA story, only 72% of the time was the person in the story actually not at fault, and it's even worse when we asked it to generate a YTA story, because in those cases, only 50% of the time was the person in the story actually at fault. Our system for the comment generation was much more simple. We had two different models, a YTA model and an NTA model. We fine-tuned GPT-3 by having the story as a prompt and the comment as a completion. To train the YTA model, we passed in a story along with associated YTA comments. And to train the NTA model, we did something similar, but instead of passing YTA comments, we passed in NTA comments. And you can see the two different models here in action. For a story titled AITA for lying to a girl on the first date, the NTA model generates comments that says the user is not at fault, but for the YTA model, it generates a bunch of comments that says the poster is at fault.